flat out strange from the other side of cinema. I'm Mark Dickerson.
And I'm Jeremy Fink. And this is part 2 of our series Rock and Reel, music films of the 60s and 70s. Today we'll be discussing 1968's Head, directed by Bob Rafelson.
Hey, hey, we are the Monkees. You know we love to please. A manufactured image with no philosophies. We hope you like our story, although there isn't one. That is to say, there's many. That way there is more fun. You've told us you like action and games of many kinds. You like to dance, we like to sing, so let's all lose our minds.
We know it doesn't matter, because what you came to see is what we'd love to give you, and give it 1, 2, 3.
But it may come 3, 2, 1, 2, or jump from 9 to 5. And when you see the end in sight, the beginning may arrive.
For those who look for meanings, in form as they do fact, we might tell you one thing, but we'd only take it back.
Not back like in a box back, not back like in a race, not back so we can keep it, but back in time and space.
You say we're manufactured, to that we all agree. So make your choice and we'll rejoice in never being free.
Hey, hey, we are the Monkees. We've said it all before. The money's in, we're made of tin, we're here to give you more. The money's in, we're made of tin, we're here to give you
Okay, so let's talk about Head. Head is a 1968 American satirical musical adventure film, and it is written by Jack Nicholson and Bob Rafelson, and it's directed by Rafelson. And obviously Rafelson's, very famous, very revered director, writer, and producer. He is regarded as one of the founders of the New Hollywood movement in the 1970s. And Jack Nicholson is Jack Nicholson. He was just doing his thing around this time, and as me and Jeremy were talking about, he's involved with a lot of pretty great material around this time.
Many irons in the fire for him during the mid to late 60s.
Yes, he was part of some really cool cinematic endeavors, some of which I'm sure we'll talk about more in depth on future episodes of Cult Movie Cult. And the two writers do show up in a cameo in the movie Head as well, in a particularly meta moment where they interrupt the scene to discuss filming with them. And to just touch on Rafelson real quick a little bit, he was involved with the Monkees as early as the beginning of the 1960s, when him and Bert Schneider had formed Ray Burt Productions. And they were trying to get a foot in the door in Hollywood, and basically they were inspired by, oddly enough, the film that we just talked about in our previous episode, A Hard Day's Night, which features the Beatles. And they decided to develop a TV series about a fictional rock and roll group. And that group ended up being the Monkees. And obviously the Monkees, there's a lot you could delve into with how they were formed. There's a lot of controversy about whether or not they were real musicians or whatnot, or just plain actors. But basically, from the TV show sprang this film, which is Head. And we're going to get into that now. So
yeah. So Head is a pretty wild trip. And I say the trip with no pun intended, because Jack Nicholson also wrote the movie The Trip under Roger Corman, which is a different endeavor entirely. But Head is about as 60s as it gets, while also kind of having this satirical edge where it was also making fun of the 60s and everything that was going on at the time, which is a little bit of a dissonant thing. It's a little bit strange that it can kind of both be that thing and be mocking it at the same time. But at least in my opinion, I feel like they really actually pulled it off for this movie. And one thing that's important to note about Head is that it was not particularly well received at the time.
As many of these cult films
were not. But particularly what's interesting is just the timing of Head, is it was a pre-Easy Rider. So, like these kind of films at the time weren't really mainstream, but the Monkees had enjoyed massive mainstream success up to this point. So this was actually kind of like a swan song to their falling apart, to their decreasing popularity. But what many people now, looking back on it, consider to be some of the finest work that they ever did.
Yeah, actually, now that you bring it up, I was going to bring this up later, but I read an interesting quote from Michael Nesmith from the Monkees when they had asked him, I believe it was actually 2012, so fairly recently, and if they asked him if he thought making Head was a mistake, and he responded by saying, "By the time Head came out, the Monkees were a pariah. There was no confusion about this. It was basically over. Head was a swan song. It was an authentic representation of a phenomenon we were a part of that was winding down." And he went on to say, "There were some people in power and not a few critics who thought there was another decision that could have been made, but I believe the movie was an inevitability. there was no other movie to be made that would not have been ghastly under the circumstances. So that really shows where they were at when
They
they
were
made
kind
this
of
film.
checked out a
Yeah,
little bit on the whole Monkees thing,
exactly.
which
Actually,
you can see in the
Nesmith
movie too.
and Nesmith even later said, or I'm sorry, he actually said this at another point as well. Nesmith called the film "The Murder of the Monkees."
Murder of the Monkees.
So that right there definitely tells you how they
Yeah.
felt about it. Yeah.
Yeah, you can see little remnants of them being checked out in the film. So one thing, just because we haven't really talked about plot at all yet, is because this is a movie that doesn't really follow any kind of linear or even non-linear plot. There's a long monologue right at the beginning of the film, actually. There was well, not a monologue so much as a song that they sang that was kind of a play on their original monkey song. Hey, hey, we are the Monkees. You know we love to please. A manufactured image with no philosophies. You say you say we're manufactured. To that we all agree. So make your choice and we'll rejoice. It's never being free. Hey, hey, we are the Monkees. We've said it all before. The money's in. We're made of tin. We're here to give you more. The money's in. We're made of tin. We're here to give you. And then it goes on, and it's interrupted by the footage of a gunshot and then execution of a Viet Cong child killer named, I'm not even going to try to pronounce his name. I believe it's Gwen Van Lem, but that's probably horrible. But you can tell right from the beginning that they're kind of not really there. But another thing that we get right in the beginning is there's this kind of weird introduction to the film where they basically say that the beginning is the end is the beginning, and everything in between is this jumbled, out of order confusion, which is kind of the best way to describe this plot. There's nothing from A to B that you could really say this happened and then this happened and this happened. It's kind of just
Freewheeling.
yeah, this freewheeling trip of a little bit of music. There's actually not as much music as I expected there to be in this film. That's actually by the Monkees. A lot of the music is just kind of like filler score and kind of sound experiments.
Yeah, but there are some scenes where they do perform music, but it's not the main attraction.
No. I wouldn't even say it's second or third. I'd say it's probably fourth or fifth in the pecking order of the most important elements, which is interesting. It's an interesting thing. Like for a band, it's essentially a music film to have so little music in it.
Yeah, and also similar to A Hard Day's Night, I feel like when the songs come, it's almost like, hey, we're going to play this song now. Okay, now let's get back to the movie. It just kind of feels like, you know what I mean? It doesn't feel like the songs are the main focus or that they were even particularly interested in playing the music for the movie. It kind of feels, feels like, all right, we're expected to have these moments in it. Although the music in this film for the Monkees, I feel like is pretty different than what they had done before this. So maybe, with that, they were expanding, with the film being sort of an expansion of the mind and of where they were at. I think the music is in step with that, which is interesting. But as you said, the movie is essentially a loop. It kind of goes back, it goes back on itself. The Monkees continually find themselves stuck, whether it's in a black box or an aquarium or a large water tank, like at the end of the film. They are just constantly trying to run from this idea of celebrity, and each circumstance they find themselves in, they basically just want to get out of it, and that's kind of the running gag, I guess, if you will, for the entire film.
Yeah, and well, I think it's interesting noting the aquarium at the end. So basically, this is going to be very hard to explain. So I would say go watch the movie before, if you haven't watched it, stop the podcast right now for a minute, watch it, or for an hour and 26 minutes, go watch the movie and then come back, because some of the imagery we're going to discuss just won't make any sense. Our description can't do it justice. The movie is on YouTube.
Yeah, it is on YouTube.
In its entirety.
Right now it is.
Right now it is. We'll see how long that lasts. So the film actually begins with Mickey Dolenz, who is the Monkees' drummer, jumping off of a bridge after being chased by a giant horde of people, which I thought was interesting, going back to, now we've already discussed Hard Day's Night, that they kind of open in the same way, with the band being chased, but instead of being chased by adoring fans, they're being chased by this nightmarish brigade of surreal individuals.
You know what? That's funny. I honestly didn't even make that connection. That's really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, but instead of hiding, they have nowhere to hide, so they just jump off of a bridge, and they land in this big body of water, unharmed, despite the fact that they jumped easily 150 feet down.
But that
And
just also that sequence that begins there just begins that whole psychedelic feel to the film, which is why I actually love that song. I think it's
yeah,
probably my favorite Monkey song because
hmm
it just puts you in that mind frame of like you're gonna go on some, like you said, you're gonna go on a trip. Like we're gonna take you. You know, I to my knowledge they had never made a song like that. I'm not a huge Monkees fan, or
nor am I.
actually like you, I honestly didn't really listen to them much before this movie,
hmm
before I saw this movie. So I don't, but from what I'd heard, the most of the music I'd heard had not been like it's called the Porpoise song. Um, but I had not heard any music from them like that. So when that song begins and he's in the water and it's very slow and dreamlike and the mermaids come, it's
With the warp, they use
extremely surreal. Yeah,
they use these
it
kind of
sets the tone
they
for
use
sure.
these kind of Andy Warhol esque colors where everything becomes distorted, and
Yeah, yeah,
the blues and the greens, and they're underwater, but it doesn't really look like they're underwater. It kind of looks more like
right.
they're in a lava lamp.
So it
Um,
throws you right in there. It's
yeah,
just
you're right in
it's
there.
like yeah. So and that's why I love that. Actually, it's probably my favorite part of the whole entire movie.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, then there's so
and
many parts though that are kind of like these wild. I mean, there's some really disturbing imagery.
yeah,
Um,
like you mentioned the the actual footage of someone being shot and
yeah.
that they incorporated in there, and that's really powerful though. I think that how that's used
hmm
in conjunction with a happy sounding catchy theme song that was
Yeah.
already a commentary on itself, and then they put that on in at the end and just to give you that last little bit of a sting there.
Yeah. Well, and I
Um,
think looking back on it now today, it's not that surprising. I mean, it's surprising because it's a surprising film,
mhm.
but it's not surprising for us today. Look back because it came from that era. But to people who were fans of the Monkees, this would be like today if Justin Bieber went out and made Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. It's just like totally
Yeah,
it
totally
doesn't,
out
or like
there.
One Direction going and
Yeah.
doing some kind of psychedelic, making Sergeant
Well,
Pepper's. It's like
yeah, that just made me think. Actually, there's an interesting connection to a more recent film, Spring Breakers.
yeah,
How
hmm
there was kind of like what is known as like teeny bopper celebrities.
hmm
Um,
yeah, like Vanessa. Who was it? Selena Gomez and
yeah,
Vanessa Hudgens and
yeah. So Selena Gomez, Vanessa Hudgens, are in in that film, and basically, you had seen them in a way that you never saw them before, and so people, celebrities are still doing that
hmm
to a certain degree, but at this time, I do think that it was probably unlike anything that people had seen before.
yeah, and so one image, because we think about why the Monkees might have done this, and it does seem like throughout this film, which is something that I'm not sure if it was how much of this came from the members of the band themselves or how much of this came from Rafelson or Nicholson. But it does seem like there is just this burnout of this commercialism, and the one image to me that really stood out is there's one point where Peter Tork um, is just sitting in a diner, just eating an ice cream cone, but he's not really eating it. He's just kind of sitting there, and this cone is just melting all over his hands. It's really disgusting. You can kind of like very viscerally feel how sticky and awful it would be. But he's just
Hmm.
kind of incapacitated, like just unable to move or do anything. And his band is talking to them. They're like, "Oh, look, come on, we got to go do something else." And he's just
Hmm.
unable to move because he's locked into this existential crisis. And he's not hungry, but he can't throw the ice cream cone out because there are
Hmm.
children starving somewhere. And it's just like this really bizarre moment where like he's kind of locked into a role doing what he's supposed to be doing despite his own
Hmm.
discomfort. And that
Hmm.
seems to be a thing throughout a lot of the movie, both in how we deal with the members of the band who seem to be locked into this,
Hmm.
what are they supposed to be doing, versus what feels right. And also in terms of on a bigger global scale, this kind of commercialism,
Hmm.
this commercially driven society. Like there's one point where there's a woman on top of a building threatening to jump off and commit suicide, and people below start placing bets as to whether or not she'll do it. And it's
Hmm.
kind of this weird crossroads between the commercial and the individual, and
Right.
how we can't really find a clean balance, which is a pretty radically complicated thing for a pop band to be
Hmm.
talking about.
Well, existentialism in general. I mean,
hmm
there is heavy existentialism in this film. I feel, and like you were mentioning, like the monkeys are always confused about where they are, their
hmm
current situation, and they're never able to escape it. Really, so and they are questioning a lot with this film. It seems like, and I mean outright, just like the part that you mentioned. I mean, they outright question things, the meaning of life in the film, like
Mhm.
continually. But above all, I do feel like this movie, much like the Beatles' A Hard Day's Night, once again, I feel like Head is a film that expresses the Monkees' commentary on celebrity
Mhm.
and their place within it. And there's scenes, full of corporate mass marketing, making fun of that. There's scenes about media saturation, and a certain attitude towards like the soullessness of the music industry.
Mhm.
And these are all running themes throughout the film. One of the main scenes that sticks out in my mind, and I actually always think of when I think of this movie, is when he's walking through the desert and he sees
A
the only thing he
Coca-Cola.
sees is, yeah, it's almost like a mirage, but it's just a Coca-Cola vending machine
Mhm.
on the top of a hill in the desert, and that image, is just that's a great image, I think.
Yeah, no, it really is interesting. Another thing I thought was interesting is how weirdly predictive of the future this film kind of was, especially in this short form jumping around. A big image throughout it is the idea of television and this
Hmm.
idea of changing the channel. And I think that throughout this movie we see the channel change a lot of times.
Hmm.
That's why there's not really one plot. It's almost like watching a
Yeah.
really like it's watching this
Uh-huh.
movie with a remote, but the remote is making decisions on its own. Um,
Totally, yeah. It goes into different genres, even like a
Different
a
genres,
war a war
different settings.
movie, or yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And to me, that's kind of interesting because it's talking about where the world is moving, kind of not post, but right in the thick of the '60s sexual and cultural
Hmm.
revolution, and I really do think that it nailed kind of where we were going in this idea of the short attention spans. There's one
Hmm.
part where I forget which character it is, but one of them says, "We're in a new world who's only preoccupied with amusing itself." Which to me that's really interesting because that seems a lot closer to
That's where we're at.
where we are now, because even the tragedies, all the craziness that happens in today's world, at the end of the day, what lasts the most is the entertainment value above
Hmm.
everything else.
Hmm.
Culturally, we love watching, tragedy, and I think that's why that you maybe see a Vietnamese soldier in this film getting shot in the head
Hmm.
right next to a music performance.
Hmm.
It's like this back and
That
forth.
juxtaposition, yeah.
Yeah, where you can't really
Hmm.
separate. And there are certain scenes that don't look like they're going to take a dark turn. They seem like they're just going to be fun and games, and then something dark happens,
Hmm.
or vice versa. Early on in the
Hmm.
movie, there's a scene where all of the members of the band are at war, and instead of really worrying about the fact that they're at war and fighting, they're having this goofy conversation about a helmet, and a football player shows up and gives one of the characters a helmet to wear, and it's like
Hmm.
it's like this juxtaposition of the goofiness and silly entertainment value and humor juxtaposed with this real life grim
Hmm.
disturbing reality that they're living in.
Right. For such a fun movie, I would say that the theme or the overall feeling you're left with is a depressing one,
Oh,
because
absolutely.
it's at the end of it
Hmm.
they're stuck in a box and they can't get out, and it's an endless loop that will continue to eat itself.
Hmm.
And so that's very interesting because I'm a huge fan of dark comedy, and to
Hmm.
me this is one big dark comedy because
Yeah.
uh, yeah, for that reason alone. I mean, it's under on the surface, it's, hey, this is the Monkees running around in a crazy drug fueled trip of a movie, but
Hmm.
really underneath it all, there is a deeper meaning to it,
Yeah.
and ultimately something they couldn't get themselves out of. It seemed like.
Yeah. Well, and to me, I would agree that if you're going to try to put this in some kind of genre, outside of the particular genre of '60s psychedelic films, I would also say dark comedy, but I would say much more dark than comedy,
Hmm.
because I don't know, at least personally, the way I reacted, I didn't really find myself laughing much
Yeah.
throughout this film. It was more kind of like when I did laugh, it was more a chuckle. Like I laughed when they started making bets on the woman committing suicide or not. But that's not. It's funny because I had a discomfort because it's a little like it seems so absurd, but it's a little too real at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah.
What this movie kind of reminded me of. I don't know if you're an Antonioni fan or not.
Yeah, I'm
Um,
familiar with them. Yep.
but he has this one film called Zabriskie Point. Um, which is kind of one of his lesser known films. So it's one I came across from, and I'm
Yeah, I
not
haven't seen that one.
spoiling anything by talking about this. But at the end of the film, there's just Like everything's going in a pretty narrative way, and then all of a sudden it just cuts to this building exploding, and like food flying out of the building, and there's no reason for this explosion. It's just, and to me that's kind of like what the Monkees are, and this movie is doing here. It's like it's the 60s counterculture, but it's just hit a point where it just has to explode. It can no longer be this thing that's just being talked about and experienced. It's just this sheer boom of the craziness that no longer makes sense. It maybe doesn't even have meaning anymore. It's just this over the top, which is kind of interesting to me, because this is actually before um, movies really movies from the counterculture became culture. You know, this was when this kind of thing was actually still counterculture, because Easy Rider hadn't come out. You know, I think Bonnie and Clyde had came out, but it was still it was in its infancy. So the timing is kind of weird that this was so critical of something that was just happening.
And apparently, the storylines and the peak moments of the film came from it all came from a weekend visit that the band shared with Rafelson and Nicholson, and they all kind of just, they were all like at a resort and they were brainstorming into a tape recorder, and that's, obviously under some influence of
Some drugs,
most likely some some weed or whatever, but that it was interesting to me that from these tapes is how they arranged the film, and I think that's part of the reason why this film, and I think this is to its strength, that it is so many different things. It is a musical film, it is a war film, it is a psychedelic journey film,
It's a western.
It's a western. It's it's a comical satire.
There's a Maharishi character in it. It's like,
yeah, exactly. So it's certainly many things, and it can be different things to different people, which is I think, what a great film can be. And obviously a cult film, because you can watch it over and over, I think, and see different things in it, and always be entertained by it. So to me, that's part of the definition of a cult film. So I think this definitely is in line with other films that we've discussed. And so, at this point, we've talked a lot about the themes of the film. I just wanted to dive in a little bit deeper into detail and ask you, Jeremy, were there any moments that stuck out to you? Do you have any favorite moments or moments that didn't play as well for you? Or
no, I mean, nothing that I would say didn't play as well. I mean, it's kind of a hard thing to define because it's not really in a narrative. So it might not have played well to me, but that doesn't mean it wasn't playing well.
How about any like favorite scenes or any images that stick out to you?
So favorite images and scenes, obviously the ice cream cone was probably my favorite of the whole movie. That was just like this subtle sense of dread that was expressed so beautifully. Another one that I thought was really particularly interesting, that was a really subtle thing, was there was one scene where a couple characters were talking, and I don't remember the exact words, but all of a sudden, really quickly, in this almost like, strobe-like seizure-inducing way, the words that they were saying started flashing up on the screen really large. Like, not a subtitle, like they took up the whole screen. And that was really interesting to me because, like the representation, we watch films, and we're at this point, we're so used to seeing people talk on screen that I think it becomes easy to forget that we're watching words.
Yeah, the editing in general, I felt, was a really important aspect to this film. The way it's edited is very creative. A lot going on with that.
Yeah. What about you, Mark? Did you have any specifics that were really special to you?
Well, obviously, there's images that stick out. Like I mentioned, the Coca-Cola machine in the middle of the desert always sticks out to me. And also the scene where, for me, the more absurd it is, the funnier it is. That's just a personal thing. But when the scene where they're doing a commercial and they're playing Dandruff in the commercial, and they're in someone's head, which may be where the title for the film came from. I'm actually not sure, but it pretty much says it all as far as like their general feelings towards celebrity and commercials and whatnot. And that's just very absurd to me, just the idea of them playing Dandruff.
And then ending up in a vacuum.
Right, exactly.
A literal vacuum, not like a vacuum like a space where there's no oxygen, like a literal vacuum.
A literal vacuum. And they were, so I mean, that scene is to me like, yeah, if you just were going to show someone one scene in the movie, like, what is this movie about? You know, I would probably show them that scene. But also, it just makes me laugh. I think that's one of the funnier parts.
Yeah.
And I like all the breaking of the fourth wall that goes on, you know, and some of the
Mhm.
questions they ask, like almost directly to the camera.
Yeah.
And like when the the filmmakers come in and talk to them and stuff like that. I like that kind of stuff too.
See, I'd like to just so do you think that that was something that was written into the script, or do you think that that was a decision that happened on the day? Because like it was so
thing.
subtle
Yeah.
and unsensational. Like
I know.
if someone said that they just forgot to turn off the camera, I would have believed it. Like nothing like so there's this one part where we briefly touched on it before, where you actually see Jack Nicholson and Bob Rafelson come in and they start talking to, I believe it's Peter Tork, about violence. There's a scene where he hits a woman and then starts to say, "Is it all right that I'm hitting this woman? I don't know if that's good for my image." And like I on one hand, like I could see how that fits the theme, but on the other, I could totally just see that being
Yeah.
just someone left a camera rolling and they saw it and were like, "Oh, this is actually a great little scene. Let's just leave it in the movie," you know?
And that's the thing. It is a type of movie where you can leave that in.
Yeah.
Something like that in, and people will just assume it's part of the film. But it really could go either way. That's a good point. I always saw that as being scripted, but now that you mentioned
well,
it,
it probably was, but like
it is done so subtly though.
Yeah.
It's interesting how it kind of develops. So that's a good point, and I think that's also part of the movie's strength is that you almost don't know what's real, what's not. You never know from one second to the next what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Because they just kind of end up in different situations, different scenarios. They could be in the desert, they could be on a commercial set, So,
yeah,
it's just
one thing that I was thinking about, because in my research it did look like, obviously you said I think they were like smoking weed or whatever and talked about this for a weekend, and then I think Jack Nicholson supposedly Jack Nicholson wrote a lot of this movie while on LSD. But what was interesting to me with this movie, as opposed to a lot of like when you watch a movie like The Trip, which we hit on a little bit earlier, which is a Roger Corman movie,
with Nicholson, yep.
You get that that's a movie that's about a drug experience, and it feels like a drug experience, whereas this movie to me didn't, despite how psychedelic it was, didn't feel like a drug experience. It felt more like a psychotic break. Like someone who just hit a certain level of existential dread where their mind quit on them, which was really interesting in that culture, because for me a lot of the movies that deal with psychedelia, I love them. Like I'm a huge fan of that genre, and I've probably said it at least once before, but I'll say it again. Like Fear and Loathing is probably one of my top 5 favorite movies of all time, despite the fact that that's not from that era. Like Terry Gilliam and
it feels like it is.
It feels like it is. But like Fear and Loathing, as well as the book, I'm a huge Jimi Hendrix fan. Like that whole era of this psychedelic art, I love. But there's also a certain level of cheesiness where now you'll have this kind of navel gazing thing where people will be like, like, wow, man, like what's real, what's not real, and there's this kind of like talking about it that feels almost like, as someone who's not in that trip at that moment, a little goofy to watch. But this movie kind of avoided that for me, just because the questions that it was asking didn't feel like someone sitting around smoking a joint asking stupid questions. It felt like people who were genuinely like feeling this intense dread of the world and asking very real questions about their place in it.
That's exactly the word I was going to use. Genuine. It feels.
It's genuine.
It feels genuine. It feels like thoughtful. It doesn't feel like, oh, we just rambled into a tape recorder and this is what it is. I mean, maybe that was part of it, but maybe that was the springboard, the launching off pad. But the film itself is very, it's very deep and heartfelt, genuine. Definitely, I feel all those things. Yeah.
Yeah, sad. There's something very, kind of sad about it that you can't quite place. But
for sure.
Yeah.
But it's also a fun movie, which is odd, and part of why I like it so much, because it has fun with its deep, existential ideas. So yeah, I mean, just to conclude, Jeremy, what would you like to say about our little movie Head here?
I would say go see Head. Go in with as few expectations as possible, which of course it will be difficult at this point because you just listen to us talk about it for half an hour. But if somehow you still haven't seen it at the end of this,
or if you've seen it a while ago, rewatch it, because
rewatch it. Yeah,
as I said, as with any good cult film, this one, you can watch it. It has many layers to it, and very interesting visuals, and it's a film that can be enjoyed over and over. you can revisit it as many times as you want. So
a real hidden gem, definitely a hidden gem.
For sure. And you don't have to be a Monkees fan, because neither me or Jeremy
No.
are really a fan. But I do enjoy their music. I'm not opposed to it or anything. But for me, oddly enough, I would say the music in this movie is probably my favorite of what I've heard from them.
Yeah, I would agree.
Okay, well, this has been our second part of our series, Rock and Reel, cult music films of the 60s and 70s. Thank you very much for listening to Cult Movie Cult. You can find us on iTunes and Podbean, as well as on social media on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And if you have any cult films you'd like to hear us discuss on the show, please feel free to reach out at cultmoviecult@gmail.com. Also, if you have any potential series that you'd like us to do on the show, any ideas for series, that'd be great. And you can join us next time when we will be moving on to 1975 and The Who with their musical opus, Tommy. This has been Cult Movie Cult, and until next time, so long from the other side.